I was down there. I was on the trading floor when 9/11 happened. It was chaotic, and the plane came through, came by my office window and all of that before we knew what actually was going on. It was scary in that we were starting to become aware of what had happened. And people were trying to call their loved ones, and we knew we had friends who were in the building and everything else. And at the same time, there was this surreal thing going on, which was trading on the oil desk that was going on. Even in this situation, there was an odd sense from the head of the desk at the time that somehow this was heroic, and at the same time, I think there was the profit aspect of it, which was that we didn't actually know what was happening, but we knew it would affect oil prices, because anything that happens with an airplane that's big, that involves fuel, there's going to be some knock-on impact on the oil market. So there was a statement as to we need to keep going where the market, where liquidity, but the implication was, and we can make money out of this.
In that I was a quantitative analyst throughout my career on Wall Street. I started as a programmer at the Chase Manhattan Bank in the 80s, from having gotten a degree in math, and that's basically trying to get a job and work in New York City, and those sorts of banks were hiring. And so from the beginning of derivatives, of looking at aggregating different types of financial securities, looking at the math, looking at the programming, I did that stuff from the sort of very initial level in the 80s to when I ultimately left in 2002. But what I also did, and one of the reasons I left Wall Street, was it was very important when I was creating analytics or directing my team as I was building them in the different places I worked, to analyze the downside, to make sure that if a salesperson was selling a product for which we were doing analytics, they were also explaining what the risks were in that product. And what began happening was, as things got more voracious and more competitive and there was more money in these more esoteric products, this idea of talking to clients about risk or funding risk analytics within the company, just like the budget in Washington, this money goes for this money goes for that. That happens in banks as well. It wasn't kind of considered a priority. It was sort of down considered. And I had more and more of a problem just morally on that, because it just didn't, it's one thing to create something and there's risk attached to it, and if someone understands the risk, to be involved. But if the risk is either A, ultimately on the public, but B, can't be explained properly, then that's a bigger problem. And that's where I started to divide out from Wall Street and ultimately become a journalist and an author.
Oh, and you write about 9/11 and the impact that had on you.
Yeah, so that was really the breaking point, I think, for a lot of us in New York. I mean, I was working at Goldman Sachs at the time, very close to where the towers had been. And in fact, that morning, I had a corner office actually on a high floor at Goldman Sachs, and the actual planes went by my office. Now, when the first plane went, nobody really noticed that. Nobody on the news noticed that. I mean, it just sort of happened, but we were sort of in the flight path. But then once all the sort of tickers and debris and smoke started accumulating very quickly upwards, and it started to be covered on the news, and the second plane came by, that plane we noticed, that plane came very close. Now, at the time, that moment of impact, obviously none of us knew it was a terrorist attack, but what did happen was everything got very chaotic very quickly internally. We were actually supposed to go to an off-site to talk about credit derivatives, and all our teams had flown in from around the world the night before, and we were supposed to go off somewhere and sort of do a Jekyll Island, but basically the kind of thing that happens all the time in banking, and just be somewhere else. Obviously we couldn't, and my clarity moment was when one of the people from sort of a major person in the department said, well, maybe if we leave now, we can beat the traffic out of Manhattan. And it was like, dude, there's something really big happening here. It's not about, that right now. But then ultimately over those next few days, I spent a lot of time just thinking about where I was at, where my head was at, where life was. I wound up volunteering to help at the Armory instead of going into work. at Goldman a few days afterwards to try and match items with people as they were coming in and just sort of help volunteer to do that, whereas we were supposed to be at work. And so there was all these moments of just priorities in terms of what was happening in the industry, in life in general. And so, yes, that was a very big pivot point for me, and I wound up resigning a few months after that.